Welcome to the Player Engage podcast, where we dive into the biggest challenges, technologies, trends, and best practices for creating unforgettable player experiences. Player Engage is brought to you as a collaboration between Keyword Studios and Helpshift. Here is your host, Greg Posner.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Player Engage podcast, where we dive into the game design and the joy of playing games. I'm your host, Greg, and today we're joined by someone who made a significant mark in the gaming world. He's known for his creative touch that brings game to life and his dedication to making games accessible for everyone and his belief in the joy of just making games. Let's welcome Senior Game Designer at Outright Games and former Assistant Game Director at TT Games, Dan McCreadie. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to say about yourself?
No, as I say, I think that was a great intro. Pleasure to be here, obviously, to kind of share some experiences and the things I'm kind of working on currently.
So people understand how my podcast kind of works, before I actually jump onto the podcast with my guests, we talked beforehand, and I was really excited to talk to Dan because Outright Games, which many of you may know, many of you may not know, does a lot of children's games. And my son, who is now 5, learned how to play games by playing the Paw Patrol on a roll game. And I was really excited because it taught him a great job at kind of how to do a side-scrolling game, because at first you try and do a 3D game and realize kids don't know how to use all the sticks appropriately. So I'm really curious, Dan, I guess, first of all, before we jump into that, what got you into the whole idea of gaming and what brought you to this path?
Wow. Yeah. So I kind of looked recently. I've been working in the games industry now close to 20 years. So it's definitely kind of flown by, I would say. Obviously, getting started, I think my journey began as a child as well. So I first experienced kind of games with my Nintendo Entertainment System. So obviously, like a lot of people, really happy at Christmas, had a console which was kind of blown away by. And I think one of my earliest gaming memories would be Super Mario Bros. 3. And I think it really just sparked kind of an intrigue I had and a curiosity with games and wanting to kind of find out more. So I actually kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say obsessed over it, but maybe slightly. So I was looking at the box art, I was looking at the kind of imagery there. Well, this level isn't in the game, why not? So it kind of sparked that kind of a desire to kind of find out more, ask why. So I remember writing to Nintendo and saying, well, why is this image not in the game? And then they explained about, well, it's in beta and things change. And yeah, and here I am now. So yeah.
Heck of a curiosity, and it's awesome that you got a response, right? I mean, my memories are at the same time as NES. I remember playing Dr. Mario, and it's just a great kind of way to get into gaming. Did you go to university with the idea that you want to be working in gaming?
Actually, when I was kind of in college, I always had that kind of passion for games still. I didn't really know it was a viable kind of career path. Probably I think it's changed a bit more now because obviously I think things have become a bit more accessible. There's different paths into the games industry. But it was actually, when I was in college, I was speaking to someone there and she was like, oh, well, I used to be a games tester. And I think immediately when I heard that, it's like, okay, how did you become a games tester? How did you find that kind of path? And I think for me, my path in the industry was starting in as a games tester and then having further kind of sparks and inspiration from finding out a bit more about game development, a bit more about how games were put together. So yeah, that was my in essentially.
So now you're a senior game designer. Can you explain, at least at Outright Games, what does the role of a senior game designer do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think obviously the roles can kind of vary from company to company. So my kind of current role at Outright, we're kind of family friendly video games publisher. We focus on kind of from preschool age essentially. So one of the roles, there's a few different ones, but looking at games from an early conceptual stage, working with kind of developers and licensors to kind of bring those experiences and games to life. So it's essentially from the initial pitch of the game right the way through to development and release. And obviously along the way, we kind of look at the kind of play testing data. We'll kind of play a lot ourselves. We'll work to kind of pass on experience and tips where we can and kind of look to kind of guide that. process as well. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot of other kind of departments involved with it. I have a lot of colleagues as well, and from the creative side where we kind of draw inspiration from each other, kind of pass on our kind of perspectives of the game as well. So yeah.
When you kind of take a look at your skill set, right? What skill would it be? I mean, coding or graphic design or just project management? Like, what skill sets do you think you kind of tap into the most in the current role?
My kind of own experience with design, obviously kind of coming from QA, going into kind of TT and various other companies as well. I think I would kind of classify myself as a generalist designer, really. So the kind of specialization would be kids games, obviously, but I would say it is that kind of the lens I look at things through, at least, is user experience and certainly accessibility as well. For me, there's a level of empathy with the player as well. I always try to kind of envision how someone's going to experience a game, what I kind of want to kind of, I guess, get a player to experience as well. I'm mindful of. But I would say it's definitely a bit of everything, and I'm always maintain that kind of collaboration with other departments and that curiosity, I guess.
That's awesome, because when I was growing up, and I'm sure other people as well, like, you think getting into gaming, it means coding, or it means doing something like that, the ones and zeros and just whatever, right? And I remember going to school for that and just doing terribly at it. And it's fascinating that once you're in the industry, right? I guess, like you were talking about, it's more accessible and people have more visibility. Like, you don't need to know how to code necessarily. I mean, sure, it helps a lot, but like, you don't need to know how to code to get into this industry. And I think it's kind of an enlightening, like, light bulb moment for me. Like, oh wow, there's a whole lot of things going on in the back end there.
Absolutely. I think, the games industry, more than any previous times, is kind of a role for everyone. And I kind of see, certainly, maybe we can kind of talk about it later, but I think that it is very encouraging that there's skills that you can learn from other industries and kind of apply to the games industry as well. I mean, even kind of, obviously the coding side can maybe put people off, but there's a lot of kind of tools now where you can kind of maybe see, maybe not the noughts and zeros, but kind of how things are put together in a kind of visual way. And obviously at different levels where there's obviously scripting. And I think the thing for me, obviously I've done a bit of scripting in my career, and I'm very much a person that trial and error. So I'll play around for a bit and say, okay, that kind of works, that doesn't. And then maybe a coder will look at it and go, what on earth is this? But yeah, I think that is the key thing, really. It comes from kind of, just having a bit of kind of experimentation, really seeing what kind of things interest you, what kind of paths there are as well. So
it's interesting, right? Because you're working with games that are made for kids, right? And I don't know if you come into this career thinking like, all right, I want to make the next Doom, I want to make the next, right? And then you start working at TT Games, which, for those who are listening that may not be familiar with TT Games, they make all the Lego games for the most part that are out there, and they're phenomenal. I remember back to the 360 days, they were coming out, and it seemed like every few months a new Lego game would come out and be rated an even higher rating than the next one. And one of the things you and I spoke about, I'd love to talk about, is just kind of the fatigue, right? Like, you hear about Bungie getting sick of making Halo. You hear of whoever makes Call of Duty. I can't think of the studio in the back end, right? You hear them getting sick of making Call of Duty, right? Like, Lego was changing the subject, whether it be the Skywalker Chronicles or whatever, or my son's playing supervillains now or superheroes, right? Like, does that same fatigue exist if you're changing the subject that you're creating from?
I think, again, I certainly can't speak for everyone at TT. I can only kind of look to reflect on my kind of experiences, obviously. But I was always quite kind of, I guess, I saw each game as a challenge in terms of how best to tell the story of the IP, how best to kind of really embrace what the fans wanted, for sure, to build on the strengths of the past, essentially, and have that as a kind of foundational point. I kind of look at games like, obviously, you mentioned the kind of superhero games. I mean, I think a big part of it was, I would look at these amazing games and, well, how do you improve on those? But also, how do you kind of maintain the elements that resonate resonated with fans,
Mm-hmm.
and what were those elements, and it's quite obviously there's a subjective side to it as well, but it's always quite a tricky kind of balance to make. What do you change, what do you kind of refine, and what new things you add? So I was always quite kind of excited for that challenge, and I think getting into the kind of mindset of a fan of the kind of subject material as well, it was always really exciting, and the sort of things that would push me as a designer as well. So, for example, on some games, I'd be more focused on the level design side of things. Obviously, we call it like a paper design, so kind of planning out how the level would flow. On another game, it might be more kind of, well, how the hints presented to the player, how the rewards kind of presented, like the character unlocks, again, another massive part of those games. Again, from my perspective, I think even though there was kind of a lot of commonalities, I was always trying to think, well, how can we make sure everyone has a great experience playing these games? So, but yeah, I think definitely just if you have a successful kind of game, it is always kind of like, well, maybe the fans want more of the same, but also you have to kind of, I guess, be mindful. You also want to kind of present a new experience as well. So it's definitely a fine balance, but I saw it as an exciting challenge to kind of, undertake.
So there's two ways to look at it, right? And I find it fascinating, right? You kind of mentioned, well, again, I'm going to bring Call of Duty up again. I'm sorry, right? Everyone gets mad that they release every year, right? And do they make a ton of updates? No, but do they really want a ton of updates? If you're on the outside looking in, you're gonna say, keep it the same, just give me more maps. So we'll compare kind of TT to outright games, right? TT was making Legos with different kind of characters, so there was some iteration there. I see clear iteration from game to game for outright, right? Again, my son played Paw Patrol, right? So on a roll, had the side scrolling. The next one introduced 3D elements. The one after that started introducing open world. And it was this really cool, give the fans more of what they like, but iterate and grow up with them. And, I'm going to kind of back up because I asked a question, but didn't ask it, right? It was like, when you're creating these games, when you graduate from college and you want to go into the game industry, are you thinking about making kids games? And probably not. And I'm sure your mindset has changed, but like, you're making these accessibility type of games, right? A lot of people think of accessibility about people with color blindness. Maybe they're deaf, maybe, right? But your accessibility is for children, right? And you got to say, all right, how is a kid going to adapt to this game? How are they going to know to pull this rope, or which button to press to activate the right pups? Like, how does your mindset, I don't know how to say this without sounding like, resonate with a child when you're building this game to see it through their lens?
Again, really good question. I think for me, it's kind of come. Well, I'm very kind of privileged in the sense that, like, I've worked on a lot of children-focused games in the past, but it's something you always have to kind of be mindful of. And I think when it comes to kind of games, I don't think anyone could kind of stand around and say, well, I love every single game. And maybe I'm one of those people, actually, because I love variety in games. I love trying new things. I love seeing what's out there. But I think when I was a games tester, there was maybe a few games where it's like, well, I don't particularly find this fun. I don't like this. Name and no names. But I think it was important to kind of think, well, it was actually someone I worked with at the time said, well, this game will bring a smile to a child's face. I'm like, yeah, it will. And I think that's maybe something I always try and be mindful of. It's thinking, again, I think a lot of designers kind of think this way, where it's like, well, I might not be, it might not be my ideal genre or my ideal game, but you put yourself in that mindset, in that kind of, space, essentially. And I think for me, I've never really struggled to kind of, maybe I'm a child at heart as well, maybe, because I think, I remember what games meant to me when I was growing up. Again, looking at kind of Mario, I think even as a tester, making a simple game is incredibly challenging, I would say. And again, I think the term simple is maybe a bit kind of not I think when it boils down to it, there's a level of empathy, there's a level of kind of experience, and again we tap into kind of other perspectives and voices as well with these games to kind of really think, well, what is it that a player wants? What is it that a fan wants? And going back to kind of maybe before I was kind of a dad, for example, before I kind of, did fully focus on what that was, seeing someone play one of the levels you've worked on or one of the games that you've been on, it's very revealing. And children are very honest. I think players are very honest, even without saying things. So, I think if you see someone play, if you really focus, things that maybe are apparent to me as a designer aren't apparent to the kind of player immediately. So, there's a lot of factors involved. I think, it is something that I try and look at it that a game should kind of aspire to stand on its own merits, right? So if you have an environment in the game, it should be immediately obvious to people. But also, you want players to sense that, I've solved something, or I've kind of achieved something as well. So, I think there's a multitude of factors involved really in getting into that headspace.
I love that. I think I think it's funny because kids are brutally honest, right? For better or for worse, kids don't know the difference, and it's probably great feedback to get because some people might be intimidated to give that type of feedback when a kid doesn't even second guess it. And a lot of those design principles, really, I mean, in all the games we talked about, right? Like right now, he's playing supervillains, and he was at a Joker Island, and it was clearly a Joker Island, and he went to Gotham, and it really stands out. And kid has no question about where he is, and Paw Patrol does a great job at that too, and I think it's really cool. I had a really good question that follows up with this, and now I'm completely blanking on what that was. But speaking about kind of brutally honest, right? And this is just a different story. It kind of takes a different thing. Is that Outright Games? I've been talking about Paw Patrol, but you had a Peppa Pig game come out, and the Peppa Pig game caught fire on Reddit, and people just loved it. I think, was it Elden Ring they were comparing it to, basically on the highest scoring game on Metacritic or something like that. And first of all, does energy like that just fuel, like get people excited at the company? Like, were you like, oh my God, what's happening? Why is Peppa Pig catching so much steam here?
Absolutely. I think from my perspective, I think seeing fans resonate with something is always what I aspire for as a designer and a kind of creator. And I think certainly kind of outright, we want to kind of work with all global IPs that kind of obviously speak to children and the families. I think seeing the kind of reaction to Peppa, I think I didn't look at the kind of obviously the initial game, but I think when I looked at kind of World Adventures, I was kind of, when I played it for the first time, I'm like, okay, it just looks like the show. And I think that was so powerful as kind of, you're not breaking the immersion from a fan. And I think one of the first things we did in the second one was you jump in the muddy puddle, which is amazing. And I think, the internet's going to be the internet, aren't they? They're going to have a reaction. Certain things will kind of obviously take off and resonate. And, I would love, obviously, all games I want to be experienced by as many people as possible, as many different audiences. And that is something that I think with Peppa, certainly my takeaway from them is just seeing parents play in co-op with the children, and then also being able to kind of let them discover and play on their own, which is what kind of excited me.
It's really funny. I've played Peppa Pig, right? I liked the game. I can't tell you I had the same reaction as Reddit, but to your point, it looked exactly like Peppa Pig. It was just like, wow, this, I mean, it's an animated show, right? But like it just nailed it. It just felt like the experience from within Peppa Pig. I was just like, it's nailed. I mean, Paw Patrol does a good job too, but it's not the same as being immersed by Peppa Pig. But I'm going to take a quick timeout here because in the middle of the podcast, I like to do like a spitfire round. I'm going to throw some questions at you. Simple questions. Just give me your first answer. All right. What did you have for breakfast?
Oh, sausage muffin.
Nice. If you were to go to a bar, what drink would you order?
It's a very good one. I think Guinness Zero. I'd probably go.
If what's your dream vacation?
Oh, let's have a think. A trip away with the family, camping probably.
Camping. You like to be with your family. I want to get away from my family. What's the last book that you read?
It was a history book. I'm just trying to think what it is now. What was it called? Yeah, I can't remember the name of it.
You know, I asked this question and I'm just thinking to myself, I don't even know the last book I read. Why would I ask this question to people? Luckily, I'm not being asked the questions. The last question, it's a two-part question, this one, right? This is special for you, Dan. A, what's the last game that you played? And what's the game that you're most likely to play that is your kids' games when they go to bed?
Oh, that's a real good question. I think the last game I've kind of played is Last Faith, so I'm playing it on the Steam Deck at the moment. And I think a game that I'd kind of, love to play with kids is anything in co-op, really, a nice outright game, which can just be kid-friendly. But yeah, I think anything that all our family can kind of experience together and not fight over.
Fighting is a tough one. I asked Dan that question specifically because when my kid used to go to bed, and Paw Patrol on a Roll is just a side-scrolling game where you collect pup treats, my kid would miss every single one. And when he'd go to bed, I'd just be like, I need to play this one level and just collect all the pup treats. And nothing happens. You get a reward, but like you can't die. Nothing can happen. It just becomes this OCD thing where I just need to get every pup treat because my kid has no idea to go get every pup treat. So that's why that question was asked. I remember the question I want to ask. You were a game tester, which I think when you're growing up, everyone dreams to be a game tester. And then you read the stories. I saw the movie Grandma's Boy. Not sure if you saw it, where it's also the life of a game tester. And it's a terrible comedy.
I've not heard. Yeah, I'll have to pass it over. Yeah,
it is a really raunchy, terrible comedy movie from the Adam Sandler's company. But can you tell us the story of your best experience and worst experience? You don't need to name games, but if you want to, you can. If you want to throw some.
I think maybe the best and kind of worst experience are tied into one. So I think every game I tested, I'll say the same thing. I just felt really lucky. Obviously, getting a credit, getting the kind of actual copy of the game as well. So an experience I kind of always remember is I was actually testing Getaway Black Monday, which is kind of like, a sequel to the Getaway on PlayStation 2. And I was kind of working on site with the developers. So I think I obviously kind of got a bit of experience there, seeing what a producer is, seeing what an artist does, seeing what coder does, and obviously hearing the groans as I'm maybe entering in bugs, real time, or, that kind of thing. So I remember us kind of just testing away, and an objective of kind of any game development, one of the milestones is the first time you can play through the game, I guess 100% or play through it. And I'm just doing my job, playing away. And then I kind of turn around and there's an audience. So, and obviously at the time it was kind of the likes of, I think Phil Harrison was there. He's in the studio. There was obviously a lot of the kind of development team. And I'm kind of, feel small and small and kind of playing it and doing my best to kind of avoid all the kind of crashes and pitfalls. And I got quite close to the end and I jumped into a taxi. Then I remembered it's not a good thing to do. And I think it crashed. And then there was, but yeah, it was good in the sense that I was maybe part of that game's history, which it's something I couldn't really dream of as a first game to kind of be involved with. Massively lucky. But obviously at the same time, just feeling the pressure, feeling everyone else kind of having those kind of work and long nights and then seeing things. But yeah, that's one that stood out for me, being a tester.
That's an awesome way to get visibility into the industry itself, right? You start understanding what all these roles are, and then it gives you this kind of idea of people who are in the esports leagues. Oh my God, everyone watching and like pressure on. Like,
yeah.
It's funny how that happens, huh?
Definitely. And I think, that's something that obviously it's maybe a completely different kind of side of the coin in terms of the stuff I look at now. But when I look at kind of, say, streamers, competitive gamers, it's a completely different kind of mentality. Obviously, you're having to kind of express your skills, show your kind of ability and your own stamp, but also commentate on that. I mean, it's something I'd probably struggle with doing two things at once. It's definitely, I really admire people that can kind of do that.
Never mind. I was gonna say we don't really like multitasking here. We don't talk about it because it gets people distracted. But with cool titles like Bluey, which is popular, right? You have Paw Patrol. You have new ones coming out as well. There's a lot of cool technologies that are on the horizon. Things like Web3, which obviously nowhere near with you guys, right? But like, does your mind take a look at these types of technologies for kind of what are the next levels for game design? How can we implement things like this? What's of interest, and how do you keep yourself up to date on that type of stuff?
Yeah, good question. I think for me, as a designer, it's really important to kind of stay current, but obviously you have to kind of look at things through the lens of maybe if you kind of employ it, it's what you're working on. But I think consuming the kind of media that's out there, obviously kind of looking at, reading stories, looking at content, staying current is really kind of important, but it's maybe kind of not overwhelming yourself, because it's very difficult to predict certain trends, obviously in the games industry, or where maybe things will go. But I think just having like an awareness and having a kind of, a bit of an understanding is never a bad thing, really. But yeah, it's something I would maybe advise a lot of people to do is, maybe pick up a game you wouldn't normally play or a favorite game, and then maybe think about how you would kind of change that, or why it was put together, question things. Yeah, it's, as I say, I feel a bit kind of, it's maybe impossible to kind of keep up with everything that's out there and different trends. But yeah, it's it's an ever-changing industry.
So in the same kind of light, right? You mentioned earlier, well, on our pre-call, right, how you would let your children play the games and notice kind of what they're playing in the games, and then in a similar way, rather than it being you, since it's a game made for kids, you kind of built on that. So can you kind of tell maybe that story we talked about the trampoline, right? But
absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I guess the benefit, maybe. Obviously, something being a designer when I first started, and not being a dad, as I kind of mentioned, I'm now a dad to 3. I think being able to kind of draw from your own family's experience, what they're kind of playing, for example, and their kind of mindset, it's absolutely invaluable. And again, children are very honest about kind of what they see, and they'll question why. And then sometimes I think, as you know, maybe you don't always have the answers, which I think is something I've kind of discovered. And I think my daughter, through playing Bluey, she saw a trampoline, and it's just like straight away, obvious thing, you want to bounce on a trampoline. But I think it's the level in which you can kind of have that interaction, and I guess looking at lots of different kind of children playing, and what the kind of expectations are there and how they play. And as I say, obviously, I think there's certain commonalities with children that they'll kind of, they'll enjoy certain repetition, maybe that maybe older players won't. Obviously, lots of reward and encouragement. But yeah, it's incredibly kind of invaluable having that insight, and I'm still kind of just in awe of what children love doing. Certainly with Paw Patrol, it's like they want the favorite pup. They'll want to kind of explore, and collect, and create their own kind of fun, essentially. So yeah,
it's fun to pick up on trends like that, and not trends, just even just picking up on the nuances that kids have. Because again, just going back to my son, right? He wanted to try Pal World the other day with me, so we kind of started playing Pal World, and there's just little things like you have to be able to read what ingredients you need to craft together to do this. There's a lot of buttons to press. And I was thinking about kind of Paw Patrol, right? And I'm sorry to keep going back to that one. He plays Bluey too. But like, the fact that there is no reading, it's very clear on the buttons to press. Like accessibility just screams. And I don't think, and I know we talked about this already, but like, I don't think people really understand like, that truly is building accessibility for games for kids, because they can't read. And you were telling me about kind of how Lego transitioned from kind of text to actually speech in the game, and how it's fascinating to see how kids pick up on this, because he couldn't do anything in Power. Well, he did, but like it's not the full game. Whereas looking at some of the new games that are coming out from Outright, like this is a great introduction to the open world experience without having to read it. And do you guys recognize these cues right out the gate? Like, noticing that, hey, kids won't be able to do this? Or do you actually have play testing with the kids or your children, right? Where you say, hey,
Yeah.
you're not understanding to do this. How do we make this more obvious?
I think it's a bit of both, really. So obviously play testing is absolutely key, but obviously done in a way in which it'll be a certain stage of the title. So there'll be something we'll be specifically kind of asking or, directing, and we'll maybe have assumptions ourselves of how people will find things, but it maybe it's kind of it will be in a place where we'd think it is. But I think sometimes if children do play it, and then it's maybe a different pivot, or we will follow what the players kind of expect from the game and what their kind of experience is. I think accessibility is a very broad topic, and I think making a game kind of accessible to me is certainly kind of not having prior assumptions, which is sometimes quite difficult. It's incredibly difficult actually to kind of think, well, this could be the first time a child ever held a controller. And I see that as like a big responsibility, really, because you don't want someone to kind of have an experience that's maybe too challenging or things haven't been clearly explained. So I think in Blue we've obviously had simple on-screen instructions, which are then kind of repeated and reinforced, having full voiceover as well. It's something that can kind of like, get most players, but obviously then, we have to kind of think that maybe there also needs to be further reinforcement with the visual aids, with kind of, the way things are set up, and obviously reinforcing when players do achieve something, having that kind of speech and having that visual feedback to go, you've done amazing. Because again, I think the onboarding for games, it really is something that I try to kind of constantly look at, that it could be the first time someone's played, but I think having as many options and ways that kind of players obviously can pick things up, and just having that kind of I guess assumption in mind that they won't have kind of had someone maybe to help them as well. And it's a big challenge and a big responsibility. But I think when you do see games resonate well with children and families, I don't think there's anything like it in the world. Hearing that kind of that laughter, that excitement, that sense of achievement. Yeah, it's definitely what I keep kind of pushing for and aspiring to see.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I agree with you. And just seeing my kids happy playing games, right? It excites me because I remember that feeling like you were mentioning earlier when we were younger. And the more people that could experience, the more people want to play more games, the better for the entire industry. It's good games to be playing when there's a whole bunch of games that are not safe for kids out there in the internet. So
Definitely.
it's a fantastic place to be. More questions about a game designer. If you are, I guess this isn't a straightforward question, but like, where would you like to go next? What's the natural progression for a game designer? What's that next step? Is it a principal? Is it something else?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think the way I kind of see it, I think for anyone to be in a space really where obviously as a designer, the kind of crafting experiences that they enjoy, I would say as well, trying to kind of push yourself in terms of picking up those new skills, crafting those experiences, you'll never kind of go wrong. I think it is kind of, a lot of it does come down to the individual. I think when I kind of heard about obviously having a principal designers, it is essentially an equivalent to kind of a lead position in a lot of companies. And I think it just allows players who really have, designers who have mastered their craft essentially, to be given kind of like that space to continue to create, to continue to kind of like refine the skills in a specialized area. I count myself as very lucky really, because in my career I've kind of been in most of the different branches of design. So level design, game design, system design. Obviously, there's different design that accessibility design. We'll kind of look at user experience design as well. And again, I think it's about finding what interests you, and I guess obviously what you're good at as well.
It's fast. I mean, just talking about the different roles in design, to be honest, I never really thought that deep into it. I'm thinking like these indie studios that just have one or two people that handle all
Yes.
these roles.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing as well. If you look at kind of a lot of indie developers, it could be a case of, your CEO essentially, you'll be the producer, you'll kind of be a designer as well. And I think maybe there isn't necessarily a defined role there. And I would say, I think sometimes, certainly not in my experience, but I think a designer does look to kind of other disciplines as well. It looks at other kind of people for the idea. And I think maybe it's a bit of a misconception sometimes that a designer always has to come up with the best ideas or has to be this person where it's just like, well, have an answer for everything. I don't necessarily think that is the case. I think you kind of you ask questions, you see what idea is the best fit, and it might not necessarily be one that you've kind of come up with, but it will be the one that kind of fits the game or the task at hand. So
Is there a typical type of game that you play that you draw inspiration from, or is it all just different types of games?
I think again, it's an interesting question because I think a lot of games obviously will take elements from different genres, from different games, from different mediums as well. So, I've seen games, or I've worked on games where obviously if it's based on an IP, you'll kind of look towards that IP and like, well, maybe there's a moment in the TV show or the film or wherever. It's like, well, how do you represent that within the game? What games have maybe done something similar? And I think that's why it's important as a designer to kind of play as much as you can, and if not, kind of look to play if you've got a certain problem, because I think it is important to kind of look from other sources and get the inspiration that way. And again, it won't be exactly the same situation for each game, but I think having almost kind of a library, and I think as you kind of gain experience as well, you can kind of think, well, on this game, this is how I tackled this problem. Yeah, it's just really important to kind of essentially keep an open mind with certain approaches that you might have to different issues.
How do you, I mean, and maybe this isn't an issue for you, but how do you combat things like gaming fatigue, right? Like you work all day building a game, you go home, you play a game, and rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. What do you do to disconnect? I guess, what would be your hobbies outside of that?
Yeah, I think again, it's a great question. I think it can differ for everyone. I think obviously one of the things that if you are kind of in any industry in any kind of job, it can be kind of difficult to kind of have a clear stop point, because you might kind of, I don't know, for me, I might be walking a dog and think, oh, this is something I can kind of put pen to paper and everything like that. I think setting boundaries is really important. It's important to try your best to kind of think, well, I can look at this in terms of this. And I think a lot of people maybe say if you're working from home, it might be to have a separate space where you kind of, that's your work area. And then if you do game, as a casual thing, it could be somewhere else. But yeah, it is different for everyone. I think for me, obviously, in terms of hobbies, I do I do find that I play a lot of games as well, I think naturally. But there is kind of, yeah, it can be certainly if you spoke to my wife, she'd be like, oh, you're watching this film and you're thinking about, oh, well, how have they done this here, or how could we maybe kind of put something like this in the game. Yeah, I think it's just being mindful of it and just taking time to kind of relax outside of that kind of space, essentially.
As someone like myself who's disorganized, when you have a lot going on with all the different roles that you're helping with, right? How do you keep yourself organized? Do you have a tip or trick, or do you use a specific app?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I find it amazing that you can from my perspective, I've loved working with different designers who might go, this has worked for me, or this might have worked for me. And I think having a notepad is actually one of the foundations that I remember when I first started. That was one of the key moments where it's like, okay, literally a door is open. Do you want to work on this level? And it's just like, okay, I've got a notepad in hand, and being able to read my own handwriting afterwards is a challenge because I'm a bit, like chicken skull. But I think it's trying to find like a method, that works again for the individual. So something that maybe works for me is having a kind of checking things off. Like, I think again, maybe treating it as a game. So it's like, well, what do you want to set out to do today? Maybe there's a list of 3, 5 things, 6 things, or whatever. Ticking that thing off, I think naturally, oh, okay, I've done this. What can I do now? That's a good motivation. But I think for other people, it could be a case of, well, everything is fairly regimented.
Yeah.
I'm not one of those people either, so it's finding what works for them, really.
It's funny. I remember my first job was a customer support agent, and every day we would kind of compete internally, like who can close the most tickets. And at the end of the day, when you can look at a number, be like, I closed 50 tickets today. You're like, that was a good day. And then all of a sudden you get promoted to a position where you're not closing tickets, and you start to think to yourself, what did I do today? Like, how do I accomplish this? I love the idea of checklists, right? Because it gives you that motivation to say, all right, what did I accomplish today? Because sometimes projects are big, right? Creating a game doesn't happen in a single day. But if you can do 1, 2, or 3, I think visually seeing that I did this today is so self-satisfying. I don't know if
yes.
a word. Like, you need that to help kind of understand that there is movement, because sometimes there's movement in an ocean that just isn't moving.
Definitely. And I think, going back to actually when I was a tester, and I think it kind of never ends. What I mean by that is, like, obviously I'm still a tester in the fact that, well, I'm checking work, I'm checking kind of obviously the design elements of things. But I think setting maybe personal challenges, like micro challenges, I think is a great way to kind of keep that kind of motivation, but also having kind of a target in mind. So I think when I was testing, it's like, okay, you might boot up a game. How do I break this game? And it's not like you're attacking the people that are developing it. You're thinking, well, this is going to make that title more robust. I'm going to be able to jump over that wall. I'm going to be able to kind of, get a high score, reverse back, whatever it may be. I think it's a great way to kind of, like, have a motivation, have kind of a target. But yeah, as you say, every day can be different in a lot of jobs.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my question is, do you have a piece of technology that you kind of live by, need in your life?
Yes, it's a good question.
Mine is your mobile phone, because everyone will go mobile phone.
Yeah, I mean, it could be argued I'm probably on that too much. I think for me, it's trying to kind of think of, ways that you kind of, certainly in a professional environment, I think for me it's how you kind of maybe convey feedback, and there's fantastic tools for that now. One of the things that I absolutely love, I mean, it's Photoshop. I think that there's so much you can do with Photoshop that isn't just maybe people have an idea in their head that, oh, Photoshop, you're touching an image up or whatever. It's like, well, no, it's the process of how you can kind of have an image, set layers to it, put text on there, convey ideas. You can do so much with it. I don't work for Adobe. There's other software titles available as well. But something like that, I think, I had a hesitancy, and happy to kind of share this. When I started in the games industry, I was a tester, right? So I was essentially, the way I saw it in ways, it was me versus a game. It's like, well, I need to observe everything, report it, but also find ways that, pressure points to break it. When I became a designer, it was a different prospect. It was kind of, there was a problem solving element, but also there was kind of like certainly a creativity element. Being able to convey an idea. I wasn't the best drawer, and I think I was quite self-conscious about that, because I had an expectation that the designers should be amazing illustrators, amazing drawers, and but I found that I think the ideas were there, but I think it was trying to convey it in a way, and for me it was learning Photoshop. It was learning, well, you can, it doesn't necessarily have to be a masterpiece, but as long as it's kind of clear to someone reading the design or viewing it in a visual way, But yeah, probably that I do use that quite a lot.
I just got access to our company's Adobe license, so I just
Oh yeah.
downloaded Photoshop, and I'm afraid to jump into it. It just seems very intimidating of a tool. That and Premiere Pro, they all seem.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but it's funny, It's funny. Everyone always says game designer. It's funny to hear you talk. It's refreshing that like I wasn't confident in my illustration skills, right?
Yes.
And like all you got to do is get the point across, right? That's like we always say, you just need the MVP, like get something viable out there that people could understand and wrap their head around it, and that's good enough. But sometimes you put your own expectations on yourself, where it ends up almost like crushing you internally. But
definitely, and I think I've done I did a talk last year actually, and I think it was the kind of people looking to get into the games industry, and I shared that because I think it is important that that you don't have to kind of have perfection in every single area. You don't have to kind of almost be the finished article with things. I think naturally I'm still learning every day. I have no problem saying that. I think that you learn off others, you learn from kind of obviously medium that's out there, but I think it's very important to kind of take time aside and realize that I think the world doesn't always see yourself in the same way that you can see yourself sometimes. And I think just because I wanted to be a designer so much, I had this level of pressure on myself, and I wanted to wanted every idea to be amazing. I wanted every design to be well breaking, and I think the other point I would make as a designer, and maybe for the audience it might kind of help a little, is a design isn't always kind of like Hollywood spectacular necessarily. And by that I mean that a design it's essentially it's to either solve a problem or to kind of fulfill the need of the pillars of the game or the brief. And a lot of the time it could be a menu, it could be kind of like a button prompt, it could be character movement, and these elements of the game are massively important but maybe unsung sometimes. And I think sometimes the solutions that you can come to kind of resolve issues in the game, they can be the simplest one on the paper. I'm certainly guilty of maybe sometimes over-engineering a solution or thinking, well, the system needs to be this robust, it needs to do that. And it's like, well, actually, maybe it's just a case of the first idea you have, the simplest one. And it's realizing that people might not actually notice what you put in the game, but without it being there, the game wouldn't be the same. So, yeah.
Dan, first off, I really want to thank you again for coming in. I know I said this time and time and time again, but you really helped my kids get into gaming. All the starting with outright games, TT games, and I'm excited about this next generation of kids getting into gaming. And again, it's this safe zone. I know they're playing these games and they're not going to be exposed to other people yet, and it's just fantastic and accessible for all kids. And I appreciate that. Before we go, there's a large number of people out there today that are looking for their next opportunities in gaming, and people are looking into roles like designer. Any advice you would give someone looking for their next role? I
think, again, obviously, every journey is different. There's loads of different routes kind of into the games industry, but I think a few points for me would be try to maintain positivity, belief and drive in yourself, and realize that kind of there might be skills that you gain in other industries or kind of other pursuits that you may make in life. They can be relevant to kind of the games industry in loads of different kind of ways and disciplines. And there's lots of different kind of resources out there as well. But I would say keep creating, keep looking to kind of problem solve and see how this might kind of apply to a design role as well. And think about obviously looking at games that are out there, one of your favorite games, or maybe a game that has interested you, and then try to break it down, try to think about how it's made, why the decisions are made in it, and see if you can then compare your thoughts to maybe the person that made it or maybe other people's views about it. I think that will kind of give you an understanding into kind of games as well. And maybe it's a bit cheesy to end on as well, but it is never too late to make it. Have fun. That's what it's all about. That's actually Judge Judy quoted that.
Quote Judge Judy.
Yeah, I use that because I think it is important that your path in life and in the games industry, it might be different, it might look different, but there are kind of opportunities, and there is kind of an industry that obviously there's changes, there's things that kind of will maintain the same, there's things that will kind of be completely different in the next few years, but it's important to kind of just maintain that belief and work hard. Yeah.
On that note, is there any resources that you use, whether it be Reddit, LinkedIn, Slack groups, Discord groups, that you personally kind of connect with others in the industry, or is it kind of just Wild
Personally, I
West?
found LinkedIn invaluable. I kind of obviously, myself, I can see a lot of kind of people in the industry kind of sharing their skills, kind of experiences. It's a great resource to kind of network. It's a great resource to kind of, see what's out and about in terms of your own industries. And it can never hurt to kind of maintain a profile there. I think, there's a lot of things like, I look on videos and podcasts such as this, seeing other people's views and experiences. I think it's just there is a lot of free information out there, and I think you can't be just getting something tangible there and working on it and creating it, be it kind of a document, a design, a drawing, or even a video. There's lots of different ways to kind of create and share with the world now.
Awesome. Well, Dan, again, thank you so much for coming out and taking the time. Is there anything else you want to share about yourself or Outright Games or anything in general?
Well, as I say, I'm incredibly biased, but working at Outright Games, I'm incredibly happy to kind of build on family-friendly experiences, working with these fantastic IPs and brands. Really kind of being focused on that kind of preschool audience. And I would say that certainly every game that I kind of looked at, I would be really happy for kind of children to kind of experience, my own family included. And it's, I think just anyone out there that kind of does feel that they want to kind of be involved in the industry, just don't give up really. There could well be a path in there.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And thank you everyone for listening. Thanks for jumping down today again, Dan. I appreciate your time and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Greg. Cheers.